I speak not to bury science, but actually to praise it. And I think during the COVID pandemic, there has been some remarkable, wonderful science. I just question to what extent that includes modelling and the forecasts that have come from it. Thanks to some questionable modelling, poorly presented and often misrepresented, I think it's true to say that never before has so much harm been done to so many by so few, based on so little questionable, potentially flawed data. I believe the use of modelling is pretty much getting up there for national scandal. This is not just the fault of the modellers, but it's how their work was interpreted by public health officials, by the media, and yes, by politicians, and sadly by government too. Modelling and forecast was the ammunition that drove lockdown and created a climate of manipulated fear. And I believe that creation of fear was pretty despicable and pretty unforgivable. I don't doubt that modelling is important, and I don't doubt there has been some good modelling, but too often it has been drowned out by hysterical forecasts. I'm not, as Professor Ferguson implied, one of those with quotes, unquotes, an axe to grind. I do, however, care about truth, and I do believe that if you influence policy, as the modellers and as Imperial have done, you should be questioned. And frankly, they have not been questioned enough, Mr. Chair. What I want to do above all is to understand why government, parts of the media, the public health establishment became addicted to these doomsday scenarios and then normalised them in our country with such depressing and upsetting consequences for many. I don't pretend to be an expert. I'm not. I defended my own PhD at the end of last year, but it's not in epidemiology, and I don't pretend to be particularly knowledgeable. But I will quote from 13 academic papers and 22 articles authored by a total of approximately 100 academics, depending on time, because I know others want to come in as well. This is a story, Mr. Chair, of 3 scandals. And the first one took place about 21 years ago. In 2001, we faced the foot-and-mouth emergency. We reacted drastically by slaughtering and burning millions of animals. Farmer suicides and bankruptcies followed. A policy allegedly heavily influenced by Imperial College modelling and Professor Ferguson. Now, since then, since foot and mouth, 2 peer-reviewed studies examined the method behind that particular madness. And I quote from them now to show that there were practical and ethical questions over modelling going back 2 decades. In a 2006 paper, and I apologise for these very wordy long titles, Use and Abuse of Mathematical Models, an illustration from the 2001 foot and mouth disease epidemic in the United Kingdom. They're not that catchy, as you can tell. The authors confirmed that Ferguson's model, quotes, probably had the most influence on early policy decisions, and specifically the introduction of preemptive contiguous culling policy, that is the mass slaughter of animals near infected farms. The consequences, the paper's authors said, were severe, quotes. The models were not fit for the purpose of predicting the course of the epidemic. That's not a good start. They remained, quotes, unvalidated. Their use was, quotes, imprudent, and amounted to, quotes, the abuse of predictive models. The abuse of predictive models. And devastatingly, the authors wrote, the UK experience provides a salutary warning of how models can be abused in the interest of scientific opportunism. It is difficult to find a more damning criticism of one group of scientists from another. A 2011 paper, Destructive Tension, Mathematics versus Experience, the Progress and Control of the 2001 Foot-and-Mouth Disease Epidemic in Great Britain, bit of a mouthful, by 4 academics, said that the models that supported the culling policy were severely flawed, based on flawed data with, quotes, highly improbable biological assumptions. The models were, at best, quotes, crude estimations that could not differentiate risk. That's not a very good at best. At worst, they were, quotes, inaccurate representations. Sadly, they said, impatience for results provided the opportunity for self-styled experts, including some veterinarians, some biologists and mathematicians, to publicise unproven novel options. So, some of the scientific work, some of it modelling, some of it not, some of that modelling, some by Ferguson, some not, was cited as unvalidated, severely flawed, with inaccurate data on highly improbable assumptions leading to scientific opportunism. I ask you, does anyone Can anyone be reminded of anything more recently that would suggest the same? I now move on. Let's scroll forward 20 years. As with foot and mouth, as with COVID, we had a nervous government presented with doomsday scenarios, sadly by Imperial, which panicked it into a course of profound action with shocking outcomes. That was the 500 dead predictions that it acted upon. After the lockdown had gone ahead, Imperial, on the 8th of June, publicised a study by, I think, about 7 of them, to argue the justification for lockdown. It claimed that NPIs, non-pharmaceutical interventions, saved over 3 million lives in Europe. Effectively, Imperial marked their own homework and gave themselves a big slap on the back. That work is now being challenged, and I will quote, because of time, just a small selection. In a paper entitled The Effect of Interventions on COVID-19, 13 Swedish academics, and Ferguson ain't popular in Sweden, I tell you that much, said that the conclusions of the Imperial study were not justified. They went beyond their data. Regensburg and Leibniz University academics directly refuted Imperial College in a paper entitled The Illusory Effects of Non-Pharmaceutical Interventions on COVID-19 in Europe. And I'd like to quote a paragraph, if I may. They said that Imperial study alleged that non-pharmaceutical interventions imposed by 11 European countries saved millions of lives. We show that their methods involve circular reasoning. The purported effects are pure artifacts, which contradict the data. Moreover, we demonstrate that the United Kingdom's lockdown was both superfluous and ineffective. I'm not saying this stuff is right. I'm just saying there's a growing body of work which is frankly taking apart Imperials. And remember, we have spent £370 billion, which we will never get back, on lockdown. There are other quotes that I can continue with, but I think you get the flavour. Moreover, a substantial number of other papers now question, not Imperial per se, but the worth generally of lockdowns. A preprint article by 4 authors, The Effects of Non-Pharmaceutical Interventions on COVID-19, A Tale of 3 Models, said the claimed benefit of lockdown appear grossly exaggerated. Another paper, in another paper, 3 authors argue that, quotes, we find no clear significant benefit of lockdowns on case growth in any country. There are other papers that I say continue in that theme, but I'll quote one more because it's to do with adults living with kids. Remember, we shut schools because we were scared that kids would come home and infect older people who then die. Well, this paper in the BMG found no evidence, quotes, no evidence of an increased risk of severe COVID-19 outcomes. We shut down society, we shut down schools, just in case, doing extraordinary harm to the lives of people, especially young people. I'm not a lockdown skeptic, as Ferguson casually described some of his critics, but I'm becoming so. And do you know why, Mr. Chair? Because I read the evidence. And I read a growing body of evidence that suggests that if you take country examples, in fact, there's one quote that I didn't read out. There was a study of lots of countries that had lockdowns, lots of countries that didn't, and the data was inconclusive. Coming through to the third element of the scandal, the recent modelling. Swedish epidemiologists looked at Imperial's work, and they compared it to their own experience. Their chief epidemiologist, Angus Tengel, said of Imperial's work, the variables were quite extreme, always quite doubtful. Former chief epidemiologist Johan Gisek said Ferguson's models was, quotes, almost hysterical. In the House of Lords, Viscount Ridley talked of a huge discrepancy and flaws in the model and the modelling. John Ioannidis from Stanford University said assumptions and estimates seemed substantially inflated. There was the second example last summer. In July 2021, the good Professor Ferguson predicted that hitting 100,000 cases was almost inevitable, he said. The real question is, do we get to double that or even higher, he told the BBC. And that's where the crystal ball starts to fail. Well, we got nowhere near 200,000, we got nowhere near 100,000. There was nothing inevitable about Professor Ferguson's inevitability, and his crystal ball must have gone missing from the start. He blamed, in the Times, he blamed the Euros for messing his modelling because, shock horror, during the competition, people went to pubs a lot to watch the games, and shock horror, when the tournament finished, they didn't. And that seems to be the fundamental problem. Where reality comes up against models, reality steamrollers models because models cannot cope with the complexity of real life. And to pretend that they can, and even that they are useful, when so many of them have proved not to be, is concerning. Ferguson is only one of many people, an independent sage especially, but also sage, who did not cover themselves in glory. And Raghib Ali, a friend of the Honourable Member for High Wycombe, I'm delighted he's here as ever, one of the heroes of COVID, noted that many left-wing sage members repeatedly made inaccurate forecasts overestimating infections. And very often they were falsely described on the BBC. And for the record,
I'm very grateful to him for mentioning my friend and constituent Raghib Ali. He has indeed been one of the absolute heroes of this pandemic, not only in his advice to us all, and online indeed, but also in serving in hospitals. But I have to say, I hope he won't mind me saying, I don't think any of us can speak for Raghib on his opinion of modelling, and I know my honourable friend isn't trying to.
No, I quite agree, and thank you very much indeed for that. But I'm deeply grateful for him and other people for speaking out. And just for the record, Suzanne Mitchie, the communist Suzanne Mitchie, quoted quite often in the BBC, is neither a medical doctor nor a virologist nor an epidemiologist. She's a health psychologist. So why on earth she's talking about epidemiology, I'm not quite sure. Third, this winter, Imperial, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and others, I think Warwick predicted, 5,000 daily COVID deaths, 3,000 daily deaths with the best case scenario. They were hopelessly inaccurate. And at this point, the tide really begins to turn. So Dr. Clive Dix, the former vaccine task force head, it's bad science, and I think they're being irresponsible. They have a duty to reflect the true risks, but this is just headline grabbing. The tide, as I say, is turning. Oncology professor Angus Dalgleish describes Ferguson's modelling as lurid predictions and spectacularly wrong. The great Carl Hennigan, another scientist who has emerged with great credit for his honesty and fairness of comment, says it's becoming clearer that all ministers see now is the worst case scenario. And Professor Brendan Wren quotes, dodgy data and flawed forecasts have become the hallmark of much of the scientific establishment. What a damning quote. But I'll continue. Which has traded almost exclusively in worst case scenarios. This must stop now. I agree. What's the result of all this? I'm going to wind up in the next 2 to 3 minutes. I will speak for no longer than 15 minutes because there are other people who wish to get in, and I'm always mindful of that. The result, as UCL's Professor Francois Ballieu notes, is a loss of trust in government and public institutions for crying wolf. And that's just it. Hysterical forecasts, models taken out of context, worst-case scenarios normalised. In the army, there's something called the most dangerous course of action, and there's something called most likely course of action. And effectively, if you want to sum up with one sentence of how we've got this wrong, we have taken the most dangerous course of action, and we collectively, politicians, the media, the scientists, the health professionals, we have presented that as the most likely course of action. And it was not. It was not. Why did politicians say follow the science as a way of shutting down debate when we know that science is complex and your outputs are dependent on your inputs? Public health types whose defensive decision-making would only ever cost other people's jobs, other people's health, other people's sanity, other people's education, and other people's life chances. We know that the opposition supported lockdown from the word go. A little bit more opposing, I think, might have been helpful. And the BBC and The Guardian salivating on state control and doomsday scenarios. And against this tsunami of hysteria and fear, thank God for The Spectator, The Telegraph, and yes, the Daily Mail, for keeping alive freedom of speech and putting an alternative which is now being increasingly scientifically vindicated. I understand that lockdown was understandable at first. I get that. But I believe the continuation of lockdown after that first summer was an increasingly flawed decision. And so wrapping up, I've got some questions to Professor Ferguson and the doomsday modellers. Why are so many of your fellow academics disputing your work and your findings? To the BBC, as our state broadcaster, why did you so rarely challenge Ferguson, Sage or Independent Sage? Why did we misrepresent experts, and why did it allow itself to become the propaganda arm of the lockdown state? To government, how could we have been so blinkered to think that following the science meant shutting down scientific debate? Why did we never use other data sets in context with the British people or even in context when it came to making these profound and enormous decisions? And why did we think it was in our nation's interest to create a grotesque sense of fear to manipulate behaviour? To sage and independent sage, well, they kept on getting it wrong very often. And to the public health types, I just quote from Professor Angus Dalgleish again. Flailing around, wallowing in hysteria, adopting impractical policies and subverting democracy, the chief medical officer is out of his depth. He has to go if we are ever to escape this nightmare. It's not a journalist, it's an oncologist and a senior oncologist. Twice in 20 years, we have made some pretty profound and significant errors of judgment using modelling as a sort of glorified guesswork. And I would suggest respectfully to government that after foot-and-mouth and after COVID, never again should government rely on dubious modelling, regardless of the source and regardless of the best intent. I'm sure Imperial and all these other people do the best they can. I'm very happy to state that publicly. But why has so much of their work been described, and I will use the words of other academics, as unvalidated, flawed, not fit for purpose, improbable, almost hysterical, overconfident, lurid, inflated, pessimistic, spectacularly wrong, fraudulent, and scientific opportunism? Thank you.